There is a record made by ethnographers in the 19th century buried today among old field notebooks and the proceedings of forgotten societies that almost nobody talks about. It isn't an underground pamphlet. It isn't a story traded on forums of alternative archaeology. And it isn't the invention of men hunting for a sensation. It was left by people trained to listen and to write down what they heard word for word. It passed through an ordinary scholarly channel, and then it was quietly filed away into the archive. The place where inconvenient things end up. It was referenced rarely, discussed even more rarely, and then set aside as a curious legend and almost entirely forgotten. Inside that record, the elders of the Hopi, a people whose villages on the Arizona plateau have stood longer than any city in this part of the continent, described a world that lay below, beneath the ground, before their ancestors climbed up onto the surface. Not an invented fairy country. They spoke of a specific place of emergence, and they placed it not just anywhere but at one exact point deep in the Grand Canyon where a smaller river meets a greater one, where a spring still rises from the stone and is held sacred to this day. They described a people who had lived beneath that land, who had sheltered the living while the world above was destroyed, and who remained below when the ancestors rose toward the light. And the question those elders left hanging in that 19th century record has never received a real answer. Who lived beneath the canyon before the Hopi came? And what became of the they said had ended? To understand why this matters, you have to start with the canyon itself. Because the canyon is the part of this story that nobody can argue away. The Grand Canyon is not simply large. It is a wound in the earth more than 270 miles long, a mile deep in places, exposing rock that runs back through such a depth of time that standing on its rim, you are looking at nearly half the age of the planet laid bare in horizontal bands. Down at the bottom, the Colorado River still cuts through stone that was already ancient when the first single-celled life appeared. And folded into the side canyons, the alcoves, the high ledges that ordinary travelers never reach, are the marks of human beings. Stone dwellings tucked into cliff faces, granaries sealed into the rock, walls of petroglyphs pecked into the desert varnish. The residue of people who lived in this impossible landscape and then were gone. Most visitors see only the rim and the famous overlooks. They never descend into the inner gorge, never reach the hidden tributary canyons where the oldest marks of habitation survive, never stand in the places the river guards behind miles of broken rock. The canyon is not one view. It is a labyrinth of thousands of branching gorges, most of them rarely entered, many of them holding things that have not been catalogued. The canyon is not empty, and it never was. It was a place people entered, worked, worshipped in, and left. The Hopi did not invent a relationship to this canyon out of nothing. They inherited it. And the place they pointed to, the exact spot where they said their people had emerged from the world below, was not a vague gesture at the horizon. It was a destination they could walk to, and for centuries they did. That destination has a name, and the name is the hinge of the whole tradition. The Hopi call it the Sipapuni, the place of emergence, the opening through which humanity climbed out of the previous world and into this one. And the Hopi do not place the Sipapuni in some unreachable mythic elsewhere. They place it at a precise and physical location, down in the gorge of the Little Colorado River, a short distance above where it joins the main Colorado in the heart of the Grand Canyon. There, rising from the canyon floor, is a real feature, a great dome of golden mineral deposit built up over ages by a spring welling out of the earth, a mound of travertine with a pool at its summit fed from below. To the Hopi, this is not a curiosity of geology. It is the navel of emergence, the exact threshold between the world below and the world above. They made pilgrimages to it. They gathered sacred salt from the canyon depths along the way, following routes their people had walked for generations. The tradition is not abstract, and it is not casual. It is anchored to a spot on the map you could stand beside, a spot where the earth itself still pushes water and mineral up out of the dark. And that raises a question the comfortable version of history would rather not sit with. This is the framework into which the Grand Canyon emergence fits. The Sipapuni is not just where one people came up once. It is the doorway at the end of the most recent destruction, the place where the survivors of the drowned Third World climbed into the Fourth. The tradition holds too that this Fourth World is not permanent, that it can be undone like the others if the people forget how to live rightly. and that the way they entered it is also a reminder of how the previous worlds were lost. The memory of the emergence is therefore also a warning, carried forward deliberately, kept attached to a place a person could actually visit, so that it would not fade into vague story. And the keepers of that downward route, the ones who sheltered humanity inside the earth, were not the Hopi themselves. They were someone else. The ones who live below have a name in the tradition, too, and it is one of the most unusual details in the entire body of Hopi memory. They were the ant people. In the accounts gathered in the 19th century and after, when the worlds above were being destroyed by fire and then by ice, it was the ant people who took the remnant of humanity in. They opened their underground dwellings, brought the survivors down out of the catastrophe, and kept them alive in the world beneath the surface. And the tradition describes these beings with a peculiar specificity. They were industrious, tireless workers. They stored food in abundance and shared it through the lean years, going hungry themselves, pulling in their own wastes so that the people they sheltered could eat. Which is why in the telling, the ant has such a slender waist to this day. They were builders of underground chambers, keepers of stores, a people of order and provision who lived inside the earth, and knew how to survive there when the surface could not be survived. In some tellings, they also taught the survivors, passing on the knowledge of how to plant, how to store, how to endure, so that when the people finally climbed up into the new world, they did not arrive helpless but carried the skills of survival with them. Strip away the name, and what remains is an account of a sheltering people who maintained habitable space underground through more than one global catastrophe. And whatever you make of that, the next question is the one that has teeth. Is there anything in the physical world of the canyon and the plateau that a tradition like this could be built on? There is, and it is not subtle. The Hopi did not arrive on an empty plateau and dream up a populated underworld from nothing. They arrived in a land already saturated with the works of people who had come before, and they knew it. Across the canyon country and the high desert beyond it stand the ruins of the ancestral Puebloan peoples. Cliff dwellings wedged into sheer rock faces, whole villages built into alcoves hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, sealed granaries tucked where no easy path leads, towers and kivas and walls that have stood through centuries of wind. And everywhere the petroglyphs, spirals, figures, processions of marks pecked into the dark patina of the stone, many of them carrying meanings no living person can fully read. Some of these works sit in places so difficult to reach that simply getting to them is a feat, let alone building and living there. The people who made them did exactly what the Hopi tradition describes a people doing. They lived in the rock. They stored against hard times. They worked the inaccessible canyon. And then, in their own time, they left. The kivas themselves, the round ceremonial chambers partly sunk into the ground, entered from above through an opening in the roof, carry at their center a small hole in the floor that the Hopi call the sipapu, a deliberate symbol of the emergence place, the doorway from the world below. The memory of coming up out of the earth is not a loose story floating free of the landscape. It is built into the architecture. And that convergence, the physical and the remembered pointing at the same thing, is exactly where this stops being easy to dismiss. Now hold the difficult part honestly, because this is where the story has to resist the temptation to prove too much. A literal city of ant-shaped beings living in caverns beneath the Grand Canyon is not something the archaeology supports, and pretending otherwise would be the kind of overreach that lets the whole subject be waved away. What the evidence supports is narrower and in its way more interesting. It supports a people with deep memory of catastrophe, of fire, of cold, of a great flood preserved in oral form across a span of time that written cultures struggle to match. It supports a people who inherited a landscape shaped by predecessors and who built the memory of those predecessors into their sacred geography. And it leaves genuinely open questions that conventional accounts tend to hurry past. Why is the emergence point fixed so precisely to a real and remarkable feature in the canyon rather than left vague? Why does the same shape of story, destruction from above, shelter below, emergence afterward, recur across so many separate peoples on so many continents? The drowned world and the saved remnant appearing again and again. Cultures with no known contact, separated by oceans, preserved flood accounts and remnants of ivory accounts so similar in shape that the resemblance has puzzled serious scholars for more than a century. Either every people independently invented the same catastrophe out of the same fears, or there is something older underneath the pattern that each tradition carried forward in its own language. The honest position is not that the Hopi tradition is literal history, and not that it is empty invention. It is that it is memory compressed, encoded, carried forward, and that we have been too quick to assume there is nothing real underneath it. And notice what conceding the obvious does and does not settle. We can grant that no caverns full of ant-shaped beings wait beneath the rim, and still not explain why a desert people fixed an entire vanished world to one exact spring in one exact gorge, or why their account of shelter below and emergence after matches almost beat for beat the deepest memories of peoples who never met them. Calling it myth is not the same as explaining it. The label closes the file without reading it. The elders never claimed to be writing a chronicle. They insisted on something harder to dismiss, that there was a world before this one, that the earth itself was its refuge, and that the way out of it is a real place you can still walk to. And there is one more dimension to the canyon story that the tradition cannot be blamed for because it came from somewhere else entirely. Look at a detailed map of the Grand Canyon, and something strange surfaces. Something that has nothing to do with the Hopi, and everything to do with how others have sensed this place. Scattered through the canyon, rising from its floor as isolated peaks and buttes, are formations that bear the names of the temples and gods of the ancient old world. There is a temple of Isis and a temple of Osiris. There is a tower of Set and a tower of Ra. There is a Cheops pyramid. There is a Shiva temple, a Brahma temple, a Vishnu temple, a temple of Zoroaster. These are not folklore. They are official names placed on the formations by surveyors and mapmakers in the late 19th century, and carried on government maps ever since. A geologist of the era, struck by the cathedral-like grandeur of the inner canyon's peaks, reached past his own world entirely and named them for the sacred architecture of Egypt and India and Persia. These named peaks are not casual landmarks, either. Many of them are isolated summits rising thousands of feet from the canyon floor, cut off on every side, so difficult to reach that some were not climbed by any recorded expedition until well into the 20th century. Islands of rock stranded in the middle of the gorge, each crowned with the name of a foreign god. You can argue it was nothing more than romantic fancy, a learned man borrowing grand words for grand rock. But it is at least worth noticing that when educated observers stood at the rim and looked into that canyon, the thing they reached for to describe it was not the language of empty wilderness. It was the language of temples, of a built and sacred place. The canyon pulled the same word out of a Victorian surveyor that it had held for the Hopi all along. And that coincidence of instinct, separated by every possible cultural distance, is the kind of thing that should make you slow down rather than speed up. There is a quality in the 19th century record that stays with you if you sit with it long enough. The Hopi were not boasting, and they were not inventing a fairy tale to entertain a visitor. They were describing an inheritance, a memory of worlds that had ended and a world that had begun, fixed to a real opening in a real canyon, carried forward by a people who had kept it longer than most nations have existed. The Grand Canyon is still there, and so is the place they pointed to. You can find the gorge of the Little Colorado on a map. The Golden Spring still rises from the canyon floor. The cliff dwellings still cling to the rock. The granaries still wait, sealed in the stone. The petroglyphs still hold their unread marks. And at the center of every old kiva floor, the small hole still opens toward the world below. The Hopi stood at the rim of all of this and remembered the emergence, remembered that they were not the first, that the land had held others, that the earth itself had been a refuge when the surface could not be lived on. They handed that memory forward until, in the 1800s, someone wrote it down and filed it away. It is still there. And the canyon keeps its silence the way the record does, holding the shape of something immense without saying it aloud. But the silence and the memory both stop at the same edge, and neither one will cross it. They tell you that worlds ended, that the earth was a refuge, that a people climbed out of the dark at a place you can still find on a map, and then they stop exactly where the answer should begin. We have the spring. We have the ruins. We have the small hole worn into every kiva floor pointing down. We do not have what is at the bottom of it. The Hopi carried that absence for longer than most nations have existed. And they never filled it in with a comfortable ending, because there wasn't one. The only question left is the one the elders left standing at the rim. What happened down in the world below? And how long can a thing be remembered this precisely by this many people with nothing real underneath it at all?